Welcome to the Environmental Crimes Financial Toolkit podcast, where we explore the fastest growing threats at the intersection of environmental destruction and financial crime. Environmental crimes, illegal logging, wildlife trafficking, illegal mining, and other offences generate hundreds of billions of dollars annually. These aren't just conservation issues. They're sophisticated financial crime operations involving money laundering, corruption, and transnational organised crime networks that move illicit proceeds through the global financial system. This podcast series brings together the people on the front lines of this fight: financial crime experts, environmental investigators, law enforcement officials, regulators, and banking practitioners. Together, we'll examine how environmental crimes actually work as financial operations, what red flags financial institutions should watch out for, and how better collaboration between sectors can disrupt these networks. Whether you're a compliance professional trying to understand environmental crime risks, a regulator developing policy, or simply interested in how financial systems enable and can help stop environmental destruction, this series will give you practical insights and real-world perspectives. I'm Olivia Dakeen, and this is the Environmental Crimes Financial Toolkit podcast. Lynn Schlingemann coordinates these dialogues. She's Senior Associate for Financial Crime and Corruption at the World Resources Institute and has spent years at the UN Environment Programme, CITES, and the UNODC training law enforcement and financial authorities across multiple regions to combat environmental crime. Since 2021, she has coordinated global and regional private sector dialogues with the UNODC and Interpol, bringing together governments, financial institutions, and experts worldwide to strengthen efforts against financial crime. In this series, we're talking to the experts working at the intersection of environmental protection and financial crime. And today I'm speaking with two people who are bringing these worlds together. Ned Conway is Executive Secretary of the Wolfsberg Group, an association of 12 global banks that develops financial crime risk management frameworks. And he collaborates regularly with the UNODC, training financial intelligence units, central banks and supervisory authorities in the Americas, Africa and the Middle East and Southeast Asia. He is also a member of the ACAMS Advisory Board, an advisor to the Nature Crime Alliance, and is on the Advisory Committee of United for Wildlife. Ned was previously the global head of the Financial Crime Compliance Framework and Policies at Santander, based in Madrid, and has also held positions at Barclays, PwC and the US Department of Defense. Ned also chairs the UN Private Sector Dialogue on disrupting financial crimes related to environmental crime. Lynn Schlingemann coordinates these dialogues. She's Senior Associate for Financial Crime and Corruption at the World Resources Institute and has spent years at the UN Environmental Programme, CITES and the UNODC training law enforcement and financial authorities across multiple regions to combat environmental crime. Since 2021, she has coordinated global and regional private sector dialogues with the UNODC and Interpol, bringing together governments, financial institutions and experts worldwide to strengthen efforts against financial crimes linked to illegal mining and deforestation. Together, they do extensive work on public-private collaboration on environmental crime. Welcome, Ned and Lynn. It's a pleasure to be here with you both today.
Thanks. It's great to be here as well.
Very nice to be here.
Great. Let's start with the fundamental challenge that you're both trying to solve. I'm interested in both of your perspectives here. Ned coming from the banking world and Lynn from the environmental and law enforcement side. What are the main challenges to creating effective, coordinated, multi-stakeholder responses to environmental crime? Lynn, from your side, you've worked with the UN Environment Programme, CITES, the UNODC, and now the World Resources Institute. What makes environmental crime particularly difficult for multi-stakeholder coordination?
Thank you. Thank you so much for the question, Olivia, and it's great to be here. I think I'd like to highlight, from my perspective, there's generally a lack of communication and coordination on public and private sector levels. They don't really communicate or collaborate very effectively, very often working in silos and operating in silos. Environmental crimes are transnational organized crimes with very complex supply chains, often operating across many different jurisdictions, including intermediaries, shell companies, and front companies, going through customs-free trade zones or tax havens with very limited transparency. So this makes a very complicated supply chain. And if you want to tackle it and see the full supply chain and the flow, you need to be able to communicate across jurisdictions between public and private sector authorities and share information. So it is possible to follow the supply chain. All of these authorities have a different piece of the puzzle, but I think one of the main challenges is the lack of coordination between public and private sector authorities. On top of that, environmental crimes are often not prioritized, not by banks and also not by public authorities. Even though we know that environmental crimes are a very serious transnational organized crimes, Many banks, for example, may be unaware that 40 to 60% of the gold trade involves some form of criminality. And by facilitating clients that are involved in the gold trade, they may also be facilitating threat finance, for example. But it is very difficult to see the full supply chain, so that makes it very difficult to trace the financial flows and tackle these crimes. There's also a very high level of bureaucracy and regulations, which undermine the information sharing and makes it very timely to investigate. Criminals do not adhere to these rules, and coordination and collaboration amongst criminal networks is often much faster to adapt to things like sanctions than those that are actually tackling these crimes. I'll hand over to Ned now for his thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. I appreciate that, and Olivia, thanks for having us. It's great to be here. I want to pick up on the coordination point that Lynn made, and completely agree. I mean, Lynn and I, through the UNODC dialogue and also past missions with the UN that we've been doing now for many years, we get to meet these amazing law enforcement officers who are just incredibly inspiring, wholly dedicated to disrupting environmental crime, whether that's in, the rainforest or environmental crime in urban areas, equally compelling. And the mandate that they have is, amazing, or the responsibility. I mean, some of these guys we meet have to cover that the number of acres they have to be responsible for. It's such a large area of land that you could never actually travel the whole area in your career. I mean, and it's a single person on horseback who's responsible for patrolling. The challenge we have to the coordination point is that those law enforcement officers often don't realize that the banks and the investigators of financial crime on the bank side really have to engage with law enforcement through the national financial intelligence units. So the law enforcement units set up, or the administrative units set up within the host nation governments, to facilitate reports of suspicious activity from the financial sector. And that's a big challenge, because what you find is that these are law enforcement bodies who do amazing work, but have never really engaged in financial crimes investigations. They don't even know about the FIU often in their country. And if they do know about the FIU, they don't know how to get that FIU working for them. And then equally, the FIU, to Lynn's other point about priorities, the FIU has a lot of priorities, and environmental crime, unfortunately, is not always one of them. And so you have this dynamic where you have maybe, really inspired and willing participants on the private side, amazing work being done on the public side. But kind of joining that up becomes quite a challenge. Lately, that's where Lynn and I spend a lot of our energy.
Fantastic. So that's the challenge. Now, let's talk about the solution that you're building. Lynn, you coordinate these dialogues globally and regionally, and Ned, you chair them. So for listeners who haven't heard of this initiative and have just mentioned these private sector dialogues, perhaps let's take a step back and explain what they actually are. How do they come about? What are they trying to achieve, and who's in the room? And then Ned, perhaps from the Wolfsberg perspective and as chair, why should banks get involved in this? What's in it for them? So perhaps Lynn, you can kick us off.
Yeah, sure. So the private sector dialogues, they started in December 2021. They're organized by the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in collaboration with Interpol, the World Resources Institute, and United for Wildlife. They're funded by Norway, which forms part of they form part of the law enforcement assistance program called LEAP, which aims to reduce illegal tropical deforestation, but they're also supported by various other projects. The dialogues kind of grew in line with the outcomes of the Financial Action Task Force reports on money laundering from environmental crimes and wildlife crime, which pointed out that the number of suspicious transaction reports related to environmental crimes are disproportionate to the scale of the issue. So there's very few financial crime investigations linked to environmental crime. And both of the reports explicitly called for a stronger collaboration with the private sector to tackle these crimes, to provide more intelligence and information on these crimes as well. So the dialogue essentially brings together private sector, law enforcement, financial intelligence units, and subject matter experts in a forum that's held under Chatham House rules to discuss ways to better detect financial crimes linked to environmental crimes. And we started doing this on a global basis online, and more recently, we are holding forums in person on regional basis as well. The events focus on illegal mining and illegal deforestation. These are the most profitable environmental crimes and also very interesting for banks to see within their systems. But it's not exclusively on illegal mining and illegal deforestation. Depending on the region, we will also adapt the dialogues to include other topics of environmental crimes that prioritize there. We've structured it in quite a specific way for the private sector, and I'll hand over to Ned to talk a little bit more about how we structured them to be most effective.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. So if we think about what Lynn mentioned on this FATF report, highlighting the lack of suspicious activity filings on environmental crime, that was kind of the starting point we used to design or to think about how to structure the dialogues in a way that would be productive, really to the private sector actors, if I'm being selfish. I mean, I personally see the dialogues as, it is the private sector dialogue. Ultimately, to me, it's aimed at trying to figure out how we can get the private sector to report more regularly on suspicious activity related to environmental crime. Because if you get that wheel kind of turning, then the FIUs are receiving more information, then they're handing off more leads to law enforcement, then law enforcement seeing the value, going back to the earlier point about these environmental crime units not really understanding how to work with the FIUs. So much of what we do has been structured around this idea of how can we increase filings, suspicious activity filings on environmental crime. And so the way we've decided to structure it is kind of at three levels or three elevations. There's like the tactical challenge of actual investigators trying to investigate these types of crimes, the different tools they have in their toolbox, the different intel sources they're using to start their investigations or to develop their investigations. And so the dialogue usually begins with this kind of tactical intelligence type sessions where it is literally, the analysts or the investigators doing the doing, walking all their colleagues through a recent case that they worked on, where they got stuck, how they got through it, that kind of stuff. The second level is more about like an operational level. And here I mean operational, not necessarily in the exciting like military operations or law enforcement operations, but in the drier, although very important kind of operational level of a bank or a financial institution. And this is kind of looking more for some of the structural reasons why financial investigations teams within banks might not be reporting so often on environmental crime. And so here we're looking at things like policies, procedures, how, certain sector types are risk rated. What are some of like the enhanced due diligence measures you may apply to a company that's involved in mining, or a company that's involved in logging, or a company that's kind of farther down the supply chain, but relies on, sustainable wood or something along those lines. That's kind of the second level, that operational level. And then the final level is our strategic level. And that's where we look for synergies that the kind of financial crime mandate has with larger initiatives on sustainability, on climate. And often, again, that's a lot about how stakeholders, for example, within a financial institution in financial crime, actually have a lot more allies than they may realize, for example, on the responsible banking side or the sustainability side. And some of the synergies there are really important. And in fact, a bureaucratic politics aspect to everything. But in this particular case, you have the very real challenge of, prioritization for the financial crime teams. What do they focus on? What should they be focused on? If they're focusing more on environmental crimes, that's going to help us meet that objective that the FATF outlined of more filings. And navigating those bureaucratic politics is often about, that C-suite or that board realizing how, what your bank is doing to go after illegal logging or to go after a mining outfit that's having a really negative impact on the environment, or a wildlife trafficking ring. How all of that is ultimately connected to the bank's larger commitments to the sustainable development goals, and to kind of other climate-related and environmental-related pledges. So that's kind of how we have it structured, and it's been really fun to see it kind of evolve over the last several years. The regional aspect has been fantastic. We can get more into details on that over the course of the interview.
Yeah, it sounds fantastic. I know that information sharing and the lack thereof is often cited as a real blocker in this area. So yeah, they sound fantastic. So that's the structure. Perhaps we can also talk about what actually comes out of these meetings as well. So Lynn, I think during the European dialogue last year, you mentioned that about 94% of participants had said they identified new risk indicators or suspicious transaction patterns, which is a really remarkable statistic. So I don't know if, without breaking confidentiality, you can give us a concrete example of the kind of red flag or typology that emerged from these discussions that banks might not have developed on their own.
No, absolutely. I think part of the dialogues, what we try to bring to the table is really subject matter expertise, because banks need intelligence. They need to know also what normal looks like. Once they know what normal looks like in the supply chain, they can then identify the abnormal. So since the start of the dialogue, we've had over 90% presentations from subject matter experts who often showcase databases and case studies, such as the use of Global Forest Watch. One of the banks presented on how they discovered the IBAMA fine database to further analyze timber that could be illegal. So we've had quite a successful results from the events. And really, I think it's all about also fraudulent documents. We've had subject matter experts identifying where to look within documents to identify suspicious shipments. So once you know what a normal shipment looks like, you are able to then further identify what abnormal routes look like and abnormal shipment routes. What does the normal pricing look like for timber, for example? And Ned can maybe highlight some of the specific findings from some of the banks that have been presented in the dialogue.
Yeah, happy to do that. Yeah, I mean, so again, if our like target demographic in these dialogues are the people who are really doing the doing. Okay, so that means like in the banks, it's the investigators sitting in front of their computers, combing through bank data, fusing that with external sources, but also the other participants in the dialogue, like the individuals from FIUs, doing some similar activity. And one of the things that Lynn has done an amazing job of over the last several years is bringing in these kind of NGO, civil society investigators, and also allowing those guys to show kind of their own investigations. Because often, if an investigator, like an environmental crime focused, civil society organization, just having that investigator kind of brief everyone else on his or her investigation, how it went, what they found, what they ran into. And then you just have this mass of really sharp financial crime investigators kind of listening in. They're able to think about, okay, like, well, how would I take that and like look for that from a financial transactions perspective? How can I, draw on some of this information to improve my ability to do detection? And so you have this kind of really good dialogue where like people don't go into this engagement thinking, oh, I've got to give some sort of like tailored brief to, an anti-money laundering investigator. Actually, it's the reverse. It says like, just like talk about what you're doing, talk about how you're getting into it, and have these guys listen, and they can draw out like new typologies and stuff that they can work on. Equally, you have the bank investigators, as they get some really good cases, they come and they provide like a lot of detail on how they identified, the particular network, how they kind of unraveled a thread, and they have their colleagues in the other banks listening. And it gets kind of very technical, and they're talking about kind of different systems and databases and queries they're running across their database to improve their own detection. In terms of like specifics, I mean, there's a ton, and so many investigations have kind of come at the backside of the dialogues. Some of the ones are kind of most memorable to me. We had a great situation where we were looking at waste trafficking in Europe, and there was kind of an initial belief that there was not a whole lot of exposure to waste trafficking in Europe on the part of the banks. And that didn't really align with what we knew about waste trafficking trends in Europe. And so like we initially did this kind of call for banks to look at, any SARs they had filed, any suspicious activity reports they had filed related to waste trafficking. And the immediate response is we haven't like filed any or very few. And then we, listened to some of the typologies on waste trafficking. And so we kind of rejigged the whole idea and said, well, what about suspicious activity reports that you may have filed on companies in the waste management sector, and then you start to have a whole bunch of SARs come back and you're saying, oh, well, these are interesting. And what were the investigators thinking about these SARs? And, often you had a decent a volume of SARs being filed on legal entities that were registered as waste management companies. And the investigator, thought they were seeing like tax evasion type typologies. But when those were explained to some of the law enforcement officers who do this kind of day in and day out, what they were describing aligned very, very closely with, what illegal waste trafficking looks like. Another one, that's a great example is in South America, for example. There's really interesting work being done by some of the banks on the use of satellite imagery. Lynn mentioned Global Forest Watch. And so like that's a capability that is like a really interesting one that a lot of people didn't have on their radar. But this idea that just how we kind of monitor transactions, and we're looking, and our focus has historically been on transactions that seem suspicious. You can monitor plots of land. You can, and if you're banking, some agricultural businesses or some logging companies, you can set up a pretty easy way nowadays to monitor their plot of land and see if they're deforesting where they said they're supposed to be deforesting or deforesting around the edges. So like, there's a lot of interesting stuff like that. And I don't know what I love about the regional dialogues and the way Lynn has really driven that is that when the thing that's distinct about the regional dialogues is that they're not virtual, they're in person, and of course, in person always has a ton of benefits, but you just incredibly rich ideas and dialogue coming out of the in person.
I can highlight a little bit, for example, how we tailor the dialogues, because we started early in 2024 with regional dialogues. So I think part of the strength of these events is that really narrowing it down to the priorities within the region and connecting the local stakeholders in that region. So, for example, we started in Southern Africa with a dialogue in Cape Town, where really we had examples of the proactiveness of SAMLIT, their public-private partnership, talk about cases of wildlife crime and how they worked together and collaborated to really get these cases successfully prosecuted. We also had someone highlight some of the challenges around Kruger National Park, for example. In Europe, we had, as Ned mentioned, the dialogue, which was alongside a Europol operation on waste crime. So we really were able to narrow down and try and provide as much information from the private sector as well to support this investigation and follow up with the network specifically to try and bolster more leads for these investigations. We also focused on the exotic pet trade, which is a big issue in Europe. And we looked at the import of sanctioned timber from Russia as well. In Southeast Asia, there was a large focus on illegal deforestation, really connecting the source countries like Papua New Guinea to Malaysia. And some of the challenges with some of the financial flows and transparency played a key issue there. In South America, which was the most recent private sector dialogue we held in Lima, there was a heavy focus on gold mining, obviously, which is very much in the news now with the rise of gold prices. The formalization of gold miners, some of the challenges there is the flows of mercury, and also their public-private partnership, MEPIF, and how they shared information within Peru and based it on other public-private partnerships as well within Europe. So these are some of the focus areas that we've per region, and it really helps to have them in person. So that's been quite a new element of the dialogues and quite successful.
They sound absolutely fascinating. Thanks so much for all of that detail that you've both provided. So if we finish by looking ahead, where do you sort of see them going? What's next for public-private cooperation to tackle environmental crime? Lynn, from your perspective, I guess, coordinating these dialogues, what new initiatives would you like to see? And then Ned, from the banking side, what challenges do you think still need to be addressed?
Yes, I think there's still, the importance of the dialogues is really to provide more intelligence. I think a lot of the banks and the public authorities are still lacking intelligence on the modus operandi, the supply chain, which is very complex. And, it's criminals are very easy also in adapting, as I said, to sanctions very quickly. So there is a need for a constant flow of intelligence. So definitely continuing this initiative and networks are really key. The dialogue has grown significantly since we started. When we were the first dialogue in 2021, we had 11 banks, 10 governments, and 5 NGOs that were part of the initiative. And now we have a network of over 100 financial institutions, 57 governments, and 54 different NGOs and subject matter experts that join on a regular basis. I think there's a need, and that's also what we're looking towards, is to strengthen the engagement as well with the transport sector. Transport and logistics firms are really critical in, for example, the gold supply chain, but also in the timber supply chain. And there is a need to further incorporate them within the dialogue as well, to share information with the financial institutions as well. Customs as well sit on a lot of information, which often does not reach financial investigators. So I think as a final note, what is needed to continue is to continue strengthening public-private partnerships, because as I mentioned before, each of the stakeholders holds a critical piece of the puzzle. And only by strengthening this collaboration can we really tackle environmental crimes effectively.
Yeah, fully agree. I would add on to the coordination side, one of the challenges that remains, but where we're seeing a lot of progress is on the NGO front. So there's a lot of really good NGOs out there doing amazing stuff, and kind of making sure everyone's kind of deconflicting and coordinating and strategies are more aligned is pretty critical. We've done some really, Lynn with WRI and the UNODC, and of course United for Wildlife has been a really good partner as well, and we've been doing a lot of good work with them, allowing us to all kind of look at common objectives and make sure that we're allocating resource into the right areas so that we're being as efficient as possible. That's a big aspect of it. It's not necessarily the most incredibly exciting one, but it's the best way of getting all the right actors, focused where they need to be focused. In terms of kind of the way the other ambitions that we have, one which we're doing to some degree now is trying to find law enforcement units either at the national level or the regional level that are already conducting some sort of operation against environmental crime networks and basically offering the private sector support. So they've already built the momentum up to have like a particular operation or series of operations against a network of interest. Now they want to add on that financial layer. We want to kind of like smother those guys with support and make sure that we're ready to go and help them out. That's very much connected to what we talked about at the very, very top, which is getting the FIUs at the table, making sure they're aligned, making sure that information flow, to Lynn's point about public-private partnerships, is happening from private to the FIU to law enforcement, and then the reverse from law enforcement to the FIU and back to the private sector. So kind of doing that sort of stuff is really interesting. And then I'll just throw out one final ambition, which is this idea of doing kind of like sprint-like activity from an investigative perspective. Certainly at Wolfsberg, we found that one of the best ways to demonstrate or to really kind of test a lot of theories on the value of private-to-private information sharing or more kind of tactical private-to-public information sharing is to set up like an operational sprint where, again, you have like a willing law enforcement partner, you have a willing FIU, you have the right financial institutions in the room, and you all agree to dedicate, X number of hours on a particular, operation of interest. Like that to me is an exciting point of view, not only because of the immediate value you see in the operation itself, but also from the policy perspective. You just learn so much on the backside of trying to do those sorts of operations on kind of what's not working, what is working, and how to kind of restructure an organization. And I have to say, just kind of final comment on my side, and Lynn mentioned it at the top, but it's really important. The Norwegian government has just been absolutely fantastic in supporting all this. Of course, through the UNODC, which is also a great organization, but it's just amazing how their commitment and their ability to support these great dialogues and the activity that we do.
That's really heartening to hear. So before we wrap up, I want to give you both a chance for a final thought. For financial institutions listening who haven't engaged with these dialogues or perhaps even environmental crime more broadly, is there one thing that you would like them to take away from this episode?
First of all, please join the dialogues.
Join the dialogues. Yeah, absolutely.
Simple.
And please do reach out. And definitely, I think it's getting higher on the agenda. Environmental crimes are increasingly on the agenda, and it's very good to see also the prioritization in the UK on gold mining as a focus area. So that's very nice, very good to see. And yeah, please do engage and reach out to us.
Yeah, I would say I'd just add on to that. If you're sitting here and you're thinking, am I exposed or is my financial institution exposed to environmental crime? The answer is absolutely yes. Okay, so you might be in a source country, a destination country, a transit country, but you're absolutely exposed. And Lynn mentioned that unfortunately you don't see environmental crime on national risk assessments as the priority that I personally think it should be. But what you do see on those national risk assessments almost always, for example, is a focus on corruption or a focus on transnational organized crime. And, environmental crimes are wrapped around corruption and wrapped around transnational organized crime. So, so if you think, okay, I'm exposed to corruption, then you should take a closer look at, what that looks like, because you're very highly likely exposed to the environmental crime angle of that. And then, as Liz mentioned, if you're lost and you don't know where to start, but you think you are exposed, or you've come to the mature conclusion that you definitely are exposed, come to the dialogue and just absorb. And we're happy to help you out.
Ned Conway, Executive Secretary of the Wolfsberg Group and Chair of the UN Private Sector Dialogue, and Lynn Schlingemann, Senior Associate for Financial Crime and Corruption at the World Resources Institute and coordinator of the dialogues. Thank you both very much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure and education talking to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Olivia.
For listeners interested in participating in future dialogues or learning more about the initiative, you can find more information through the World Resources Institute and the Wolfsberg Group websites. The Environmental Crimes Financial Toolkit podcast is produced in partnership with WWF UK and Themis. You can find resources, guidance and additional materials on our website at wearethemis.com/UK. Thanks for listening.